Is that my cue? All right, thank you. Hello, everybody. Thank you for accommodating me to do this via Skype. I'm very appreciative of that. I would like to begin by acknowledging that the land on which we gather is the traditional territory of the Peoria, Anishinaabe, Potawatomi, and Miami nations covered by Session 66. Today it is home to a diverse population of indigenous and other peoples. I respect the continued connections with the past, present, and future in our ongoing relationships within the Detroit and Wayne State University community. Humans love to tell stories. Our species has been weaving tales together since we've developed the means to do so. And we have held these stories close, telling them again and again and again in new mediums as they present themselves. And recently, video games has been added to that viable list. So today, I'm going to look at the game Kisima Inŋitchuŋa, better known as Never Alone, to illustrate how Inupiat myth is still serving a teleological function. This game is built upon indigenous epistemologies that emerge through gameplay, that itself becomes an act of storytelling. And this examination reveals that there is more to this retelling than merely fun in games. It's about survivance. So, the game is a platform puzzle format that requires one or two players to operate, either the human or fox protagonists. You have to use your wits and perseverance to make it through. Never Alone was a rare game that was made by Indigenous people with the express purpose of promoting cultural pride among Inupiat youth. We have Gloria O'Neill of the Yupik CEO, Cook Inlet Tribal Council, to thank for instigating that initiative in 2012. The CITC then partnered with Eli Media as Upper One Games and produced this game in 2014. The start of the story was originally told by Robert Nasruk Cleveland and adapted by Eli Media with the permission of Cleveland's daughter, Minnie Gray. In summary, because who wants to spoil a good story, a young hunter boy named Sayuka seeks out the source of a merciless blizzard so that his family will not starve. In this game, the male protagonist is replaced with Nuna, a young girl and a companionable Arctic fox. Smaller challenges were added along the journey to fill out the game. And this is where we get to the story of the game, or rather, the game as story. Mythology is everywhere, and it permeates grammar, encroaches upon language through metaphor, and spreads into syntax. Furthermore, it is necessary to remember that myths themselves are a means of knowledge. They're more than stories of spirits and seasons, but rather explain systems of other understanding, the relationship between persons and landscapes that are inaccessible or even incomprehensible otherwise. And that is why oral storytelling is valuable but fragile. It's not performed at random. It has to be prompted, drawn to the front of the teller's mind. It's also constantly emerging as a narrative that is as infinite as that mind, changing profoundly across generations. And yet it endures as the efforts of that relentless human refusal to fade into oblivion. Each time it's told, it's the true version, the same version, no matter how much it's changed. Thus, Never Alone is not exactly a retelling of myth, but a telling. It's not something new because it has always been this way. It has always been changing. And this is because indigenous storytelling practices, which are rooted in orality, are fluid, multivalent, polyvocal, embedded in relational. In this, they differ from Western norms, which, built around the written form, call for a more linear and authoritative approach. The game presents a different story each time it is started, but the plot itself is fixed. It's evolving according to our choices as we play. That being said, telling requires an audience to hear it, and in turn be shaped by the audience. Listening might seem like a passive action. Just sit down, get comfy while someone else does all the work. But this is only true to an extent, because the mere act of listening is participating in storytelling. In fact, you are participating in this presentation by listening. You're imagining what is being told to you. You're remembering it. You're learning it. These are not passive actions. And noted scholar Joanne Archibald describes that the communal principle of storytelling implies that a listener is or becomes a member of that community. Gaming kicks this up a few notches by making us act out the story in virtual space. Learning becomes a cognitive act requiring the player to make choices. We become part of that narrative. In fact, we're not just players, we become co-storytellers with the narrator. Which leads us to the question, what story are we telling and what lessons are being learned? At this point, I want to introduce the term serious games. For those who may be familiar with Sherry Ortner, it refers to a metaphor where life is a game. Social structures are the field, and norms and cultural constraints are the rules. Anderson et al. Uses the term to describe, quote, computer games that are not limited to the aim of providing entertainment, that allow for collaborative use of 3D spaces that are used for learning and educational purposes in a number of application domains, end quote. Never Alone teaches the former and is the latter. Myths serve as one means of setting out the rules and creating that playing field. One of the beautiful things about stories, especially games, is that they allow us to become the protagonist, as I have already explained. We can step into the lives of others and walk around in their shoes, learning through trial and error. And in my case, that's a lot of trial and error. I'm not a very good gamer. This is crucial to the storywork foundation of Never Alone, as Indigenous knowledge cannot be found in a book, only through experience. The game gives the player a glimpse into that long process by contextualizing Inuit IQ for short, in ways that create opportunities for listening and reflecting upon, and engaging. The player encounters the knowledge in the environment that requires it, and also learns how to apply it around their own epistemologies. In this virtual space, out of place, out of time, they can practice two-eyed seeing from Western and Indigenous modes of knowledge. This also supplies the player with the means of exploring multiple points of view. This game is infused with the foundational principles of Inupiat people, interconnectedness and interdependence. This is conveyed through the juxtaposition of interview clips, which are labeled as cultural insights, with gameplay. For instance, at one point, the protagonist must jump across shrinking ice floes, relating to the disappearing ice from climate change described in the previous clip. The presence of the player on an ice sheet is directly responsible for it melting, and that lesson is clear. We are responsible to care for the environment. In this way, Never Alone redefines the isolated inuk who lives alone in the desolated tundra, by supplying us instead with a thriving landscape which is filled with life and relationships that we are called upon to maintain. This dependence is also experienced in the fact that in this game, you are always playing with another, either an AI to control the fox in single-player mode, or a friend in multiplayer mode. And I want to focus on the former for a moment, as it hasn't been touched upon as much as the latter. In Chalana academia, we have this notion that non-human means either inanimate or incapable of agency. We categorize these agents as tools in our life journeys. But that's not the case in IQ. Non-human entities, even the landscape, which is described as intensely human and alien all at once, are players in their own right, and sometimes that means they will work against you for their own purposes. The AI fox will jump into danger without warning, causing you to start the level over again. In multiplayer, your friend is in control of the furry accomplice. Either way, you're forced to work with another human being or non-human agent in order to accomplish your goal. You are quite literally never alone and cannot survive without cooperation. And through the challenges that Nuna must face, the player must figure out their relationship with the non-human. The gameplay forces the player to interact with animals on the animals' terms rather than use them to suit her needs. The land, the animals, the plants, the weather, and the spirits cannot be controlled. They can be reasoned with, and we can try and harness them, but in the end, they do not exist for us. We must respect these agents or be killed by them. Therefore, the game teaches the necessity of building respectful relationships that lead to mutually beneficial ends. At the heart of this paper is a story and what telling stories does to us, as listeners and as players. Never Alone was crafted to guide the player into unlocking cultural insights that explain some of the traditions and beliefs that still inform Inupiat lives, and consequently, the game it created. The game functions as myths do, informing identity, because myths are our past, our history, and our heritage, but they are also our present and our future. They make the world and instruct us in how to inhabit it. We are the stories we tell. And this leads us to survivance. It's a relatively new concept among anthropology and humanities that goes beyond resistance to show a flourishing of identity in spite of processes that seek to silence it. Never Alone is a process and a product of that practice that is predicated on the success of other multimedia projects concerning IQ. In short, this is an example of indigenous media that is not new, but a new emergence of a centuries-old way of relating to others, which has much to offer on many levels as it reamps and remaps cultural practices. The use of storytelling in survivance is critical as it reasserts the primacy of the knowledge and the validation of the speaker. It relies on tradition. And one of the first things I noticed in the original launch, when the original launch trailer came out, was that I couldn't understand the audio. I had to rewatch it 4 times to realize that it wasn't due to my impaired hearing, but because the narrator was speaking in his own language. The game is the same, with English being relegated to the subtitles. Therefore, prioritizing Inupiat is a bold statement that this is not a story being mangled to fit Western forms. It is unrepentantly indigenous. And at the same time, the story is told through technology and apparatus that did not even exist a decade ago. Never Alone is a critique of gaming culture and the Western gaze upon indigenous systems of knowledge. And most obviously, to focus on Inupiat culture as a foundational framework, rather than as a setting, or to create a game that simply reinforces paradigms of otherness and historiosity. This was only possible through the active presence of indigenous partners to guide, and most importantly, to direct the game's development. The narrative is controlled by the people it came from, which in turn asserts the presence of indigenous people in the present. The Inupiat are shown as a living people, not a remnant of history. And that is what survivance is. Using what is available to maintain your lifestyle, to adapt in ways that bring about new meaning to the old with open arms. As Brown puts it, breathing life through the centuries, transcending intertextual spaces and the gaps between 0 and 1 in streams of code. To conclude, Never Alone is an example of how indigenous survivance and storytelling have breached into the digital and virtual world. Using myth, it is the same story told anew, without actually changing all that much. Playing as Nuna incorporates us into the story, inserting the player into a tangle of interdependent relationships, and teaching us the same systems of knowledge that continue to ring true. This game is proof that myths are still being told, because they still have purpose in our lives. This conference asked us to consider why we tell and retell stories. And my answer is that we do so because myths have something to say. But a crucial part of storytelling and retelling happens after the tale is finished. After we learn how to listen to the story, we are expected to continue its existence by sharing it. So I'll end with the small plug that this is a commercially available game. You can get it for around $20. So grab a few friends, gather around the console, share a story. Thank you.